They told her she was too old, too slow, too irrelevant for a job stocking shelves. But the moment a child teetered over a railing and she sprinted into action, none of that mattered anymore. Like, subscribe, and share if you believe every life experience is a strength, not a setback. Grace Delaney sat quietly in the plastic waiting chair just outside the office door of Maple Main Department Store, smoothing the crease in her navy slacks for the third time. She glanced at the clock above the employee bulletin board and noted she was 5 minutes early. Always 5 minutes early. Old habits didn't die, even if most everything else had. Her resume was neatly tucked in a leather folder, resting in her lap like a shield. She had practiced every answer in the mirror that morning, brushing aside the faintest signs of nerves with a smile and a whispered, "You've got this." At 58, Grace had spent the last 2 years trying to reassemble her life after losing Tom. He had been her husband for 33 years. They had built a world together, a modest home, 2 daughters, weekends at the lake, crossword puzzles on Sunday mornings. When cancer came for him, it did not ask politely. It just took. And when it was done, it left her sitting in a quiet kitchen with an empty mug across from hers and nothing to pour but memories. She had applied to dozens of places since: bookstores, cafes, call centers, and grocery chains, anywhere she could feel useful again. The need wasn't purely financial. Tom had left her stable enough, but there was a hunger in her for movement, purpose, connection. The silence of her days was beginning to press against her like a closed room with no windows. The door opened with a polite creak, and a young woman in a red vest motioned her in. Grace rose, straightened her blouse, and stepped into the office. "Hi, Mrs. Delaney. I'm Kelsey," said the woman, not much older than Grace's youngest granddaughter. Her smile was tight and professional. She didn't offer a handshake. "Thank you for seeing me," Grace said, offering her folder. Kelsey took it without looking. She tapped a few keys on her laptop. "Right, so you're applying for the floor associate position. You've got quite a bit of experience, but I don't see any retail listed here." "No, not officially," Grace admitted. "But I helped run fundraising events for the PTA for years, organized community drives, and I did inventory and logistics for my church's food pantry. A lot of that translates to retail keeping, things stocked, managing flow, helping people." Kelsey clicked around on her screen. "Well, we usually look for people who've worked in fast-paced environments. It's a lot of lifting, moving, bending, and we have to meet restock quotas. It can be demanding." Grace nodded. "I understand. I'm in good health. I walk 3 miles every morning, and I don't mind getting my hands dirty." Kelsey offered a polite smile again, but her eyes had drifted to her screen. "Sure. Well, we'll be in touch. We've got a lot of applicants right now. Some of them just better fit the physical requirements." Grace's heart dipped, but she didn't let it show. She nodded, stood, and thanked her. She left the office with shoulders square and chin lifted, even as something inside her felt quietly bruised. She had not been naive about the odds. Still, the dismissiveness in the girl's tone had cut sharper than she'd expected. Outside, she passed the glossy racks of folded denim and discount shoes, the scent of mall pretzels drifting faintly through the store's air vents. She reached the double doors, pushing into the late morning sun that painted the parking lot in slats of heat and shadow. Grace paused for a moment at the base of the wide entrance steps, willing her eyes not to sting. Behind her, the store's escalators hummed steadily, lifting and lowering shoppers between levels. Children laughed in spurts, a soundtrack she once knew well. Grace glanced up, half-heartedly. A woman was browsing the balcony level of the home goods section, her phone tucked between her shoulder and ear, her toddler trailing close behind. And then the air changed. It was a shift, a beat of silence before sound returned. Grace heard it before she saw it, a sharp, panicked cry, a gasp from a bystander. And then movement, a child too close to the edge, a tiny hand clutching nothing, a blur of motion as a body fell forward over the balcony. Grace dropped her folder. Her feet moved without thought, muscle memory rising from a life that had once been filled with scraped knees and sprinting toward danger. She ran forward, calculating angles she didn't know she still understood. Her arms stretched up, just as the child's small body plummeted downward. Time became a strange, soft thing. The boy's face twisted in fear, tiny fists clenched. Grace caught him in both arms, stumbling backward from the force, knees bending to absorb the shock. They collapsed into a heap, together on the smooth tile floor, her back absorbing most of the impact. The boy clutched her shirt and wailed, but he was breathing. Alive. Whole. People surrounded her in seconds. Voices layered over each other. "Oh my God, is he okay?" "I thought he was gone." Grace was dimly aware of the mother descending the stairs 2 at a time, her face pale, eyes wide and unseeing until she reached them. She dropped to her knees. "Benji!" she sobbed, scooping the boy from Grace's arms. He latched to her neck with wet cheeks and hiccuped sobs. Grace stayed on the floor, catching her breath. A man offered her a hand, which she took with shaking fingers. Her knees throbbed, and there was a dull ache along her back, but she had caught him. The mother stood and turned toward her. She looked early 40s, sharp in a tailored blouse and heels not meant for chasing toddlers. Her expression was a mix of horror, gratitude, and disbelief. "You," she began breathless. "You caught him. I don't know how to—" "It's all right," Grace said softly, her voice steadier than she felt. "He's all right. That's what matters." The woman blinked back tears. "I turned for 1 second. He just climbed." "I've had kids," Grace said gently. "It happens." Someone from the store was calling security. Another employee was holding her folder, looking at her now as if she had grown wings. The woman stepped closer, studying her. "I'm Julia Barrett." Grace nodded, still catching her breath. "Grace Delaney." Julia was silent for a long moment. She glanced at her child, then back at Grace. Her gaze narrowed thoughtfully, not in suspicion, but curiosity. There was something evaluative in her expression now, a mental list she was quietly checking off. "You weren't just fast," Julia finally said. "You were precise. You knew exactly where to stand." Grace shook her head. "Just luck and instinct, I guess." Julia opened her mouth as if to speak, then hesitated. She looked over her shoulder toward the store entrance and the bustling mall beyond, then back at Grace. "We need to talk," she said. Grace blinked. "About what?" But Julia just smiled faintly, as if a plan had already begun to take shape. Grace didn't know then that this moment, this catch, would be the start of everything. The mall's security guards arrived minutes later, their radios crackling as they assessed the situation. One knelt beside Grace, asking if she was all right, while the other hovered near Julia, who was still holding her son tightly. Grace answered the questions with composure, waving off any suggestion of needing an ambulance. Her back ached, and her legs still trembled beneath her, but she had no intention of leaving in a stretcher. It had all happened so quickly, and yet every second of it now played back in her mind with slow, searing clarity. She hadn't seen the boy until he had already begun to fall. One moment he had been peeking over the railing, his little fingers barely gripping the edge, and the next he was in the air. There hadn't been time to think, only to move. Her body had reacted on its own. She had thrown herself forward, arms outstretched, just in time to catch him in the cradle of her chest and arms before he hit the ground. The weight of him, the momentum of the fall, had nearly knocked her off her feet. They had landed in a tangled heap, but he had not broken a bone, not even a bruise that she could see. Grace's ribs throbbed, but the boy's cry had told her everything she needed to know. He was alive. Now, as the crowd began to thin and store staff started to guide people away, Julia crouched beside her again, brushing her son's curls from his forehead. The boy, small and wide-eyed with shock, clung to her neck. Grace noticed the delicate chain around Julia's wrist and the polished sheen of her shoes. There was an air of practiced confidence about her, even now, though it was momentarily cracked by gratitude and shaken nerves. "I still can't believe what just happened," Julia said, her voice low. Grace exhaled, trying to steady her breathing. "Neither can I." Julia looked her in the eyes then, holding her gaze for longer than a stranger usually would. Her expression was more than thankful. It was calculating in a way that didn't feel cold, just intensely focused. She was studying Grace, weighing something silently. "Do you need someone to take you to urgent care?" she asked finally. "Or to drive you home?" Grace shook her head. "I'm fine. A little sore. Nothing serious." "You sure?" Julia's tone softened. "I have a driver. I can have him take you anywhere you need to go." "No, really," Grace replied. "I don't live far. I'll be okay." Julia nodded, though she looked unconvinced. "Let me at least buy you coffee or lunch or something. I don't think a simple thank you is going to cut it." Grace smiled gently. "Your little boy's okay. That's thanks enough." Julia glanced at her son again. "Benji," she whispered into his hair. The boy, his tears drying on her shoulder, had begun to drift into a dazed, quiet calm. "Grace, was it?" she asked. "Yes, Grace Delaney." "I'm Julia Barrett." She hesitated, then reached into her handbag and pulled out a sleek business card. "Please, let me keep in touch." Grace accepted the card politely. The logo at the top was unfamiliar to her, a stylized letter A in soft green against ivory. Beneath it, Julia's name and title were printed in crisp black ink. Senior Vice President, Brand Experience and Retail Strategy. Her eyebrows rose slightly. "I'm not just a frantic mom," Julia said with a small laugh, catching the flicker of surprise in Grace's face. "Though I suppose I was today." Grace handed back the card. No, I'll keep it. Thank you." Julia straightened, adjusting the boy in her arms. "Listen, I'm serious. I don't just hand out my card. There's something about you. You didn't just react, you moved with purpose. That wasn't luck. That was instinct. I guess when you've raised 2 daughters and babysat half your church's toddlers, you get a sense for when something's about to go sideways." Julia smiled, but her eyes were still fixed on Grace with that quiet, assessing attention. "I'm going to call you, not just to say thank you again. I think there's something we could talk about. Something bigger." Grace looked at her, puzzled. "Like what?" "Let me explain later," Julia said, offering a mysterious smile that barely reached her eyes. "Once you've rested, once I've sorted a few things out." With that, Julia turned, whispering to Benji, who nodded sleepily, his fingers tangled in her silk blouse. The mother and child walked off toward the parking lot as the mall's noise slowly returned to its regular hum. A few people still stared at Grace, murmuring, and a young man in a beanie even offered to shake her hand. She did, feeling the sting of fatigue now setting into her shoulders and back. The store's assistant manager, the same young woman who had turned her down moments earlier, reappeared beside her. She held Grace's leather folder in both hands, looking unsure of what to say. That was amazing," she managed, cheeks flushed. "Seriously, I didn't think anyone could catch him." Grace took the folder with a nod, saying nothing. Kelsey looked as though she wanted to say more, perhaps even apologize, but couldn't find the right words. Grace spared her the awkwardness. "Take care," Grace said, her voice kind but cool. She didn't need pity now, not from someone who had looked at her and seen only fragility. As she walked toward her car, her legs still trembling from the adrenaline, Grace felt the first real sting of pain deep in her lower back. She paused, one hand pressed against the side of her car, and let herself breathe for a long moment. The sun cast warm light over the asphalt, and a breeze stirred her short silver hair. The shock had worn off. Now came the ache, and behind it, something else, something unfamiliar. She didn't know what Julia Barrett meant by something bigger, but the words had planted a seed she couldn't quite ignore. Sliding into the driver's seat, she laid the business card gently on the passenger's seat beside her purse. She read the words again, running her thumb over the embossed logo. She had expected this day to end in quiet rejection, another bruise to her pride. Instead, she had caught a child out of the air and made a powerful woman pause in her tracks. Grace didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in a long while, she felt something spark in her chest, not hope, exactly, but possibility. She turned the key in the ignition, and as the engine purred to life, she whispered under her breath, "Tom, did you see that?" Then, without another glance behind, she pulled out of the lot and drove into the afternoon sun. Grace didn't expect to hear from Julia Barrett again. People said things in emotional moments, promises carried on a rush of adrenaline and guilt. She had caught the child, yes, but she didn't expect it to change her life. In fact, after the incident, she returned home to her modest bungalow and tried to settle into the usual rhythm of things. She fed the cat, boiled water for tea, and stood staring at the microwave as it counted down 2 minutes for a frozen meal she wasn't truly hungry for. The pain in her back had dulled to a persistent ache, nothing alarming, just the kind of hurt that reminded her she wasn't as young as she used to be. She sat in her living room, the late afternoon light painting long shadows on the hardwood floor, and placed Julia's business card on the table. It looked expensive in a way she couldn't quite describe, as if the card itself carried a certain kind of authority. Still, she didn't call. What would she say? That she was fine, no need to make a fuss, thank you for the gesture. Grace didn't want a reward, didn't need her name in lights. She just wanted to move forward, to feel useful again, and that had little to do with falling children or elegant women in tailored blouses. The next morning, she woke with stiffness along her left side. It took a few moments of stretching to feel normal again, but she managed. The phone rang around 9. She didn't recognize the number, but something in her made her answer anyway. "Grace Delaney?" came Julia's voice, clear and unhurried. "Yes," Grace replied, surprised by how awake she sounded. "I hope I didn't catch you at a bad time." Grace hesitated, then smiled to herself. "No, it's fine. Just finished my second cup of coffee. I hope you're feeling all right." "I am. A little sore, but nothing serious." "I'm glad to hear that," Julia said. There was a pause on the other end, a quiet that didn't feel empty, but rather deliberate. "I wasn't exaggerating when I said I wanted to talk again. What you did yesterday was extraordinary." "I just did what any person would have done," Grace replied. "No," Julia said, and her voice softened. "Not any person. You moved like you trained for it. You took a risk others would have hesitated over, and you did it instinctively." Grace didn't respond right away. She didn't think of herself as extraordinary. She didn't even think of herself as brave. She had simply seen a child falling and moved without thinking. That was all. "I'd like to meet you for lunch," Julia continued. "My treat. And not just to say thank you. I want to talk to you about something." Grace was still, her eyes flicking back to the card on the table. "I'm not selling anything," Julia added with a small laugh. "In fact, if this works out, I might be the one doing the buying." That made Grace chuckle. Where and when? They agreed to meet that Thursday, 2 days later, at a small cafe near the downtown business district. Grace arrived early, as always. She chose a table near the window, where the light filtered in soft and warm. She wore a crisp white blouse and dark blue trousers, her silver hair pulled back neatly at the nape of her neck. She had debated whether to dress up more, to wear something with more flair, but in the end she decided to be herself. There was no sense in pretending. Julia arrived 5 minutes after noon, gliding through the door with her phone in one hand and sunglasses in the other. She wore a light trench over a fitted dress, heels clicking against the tile. When she saw Grace, she smiled, genuinely, and crossed the room quickly. "I hope you didn't wait long," she said, setting her phone face down on the table and slipping into the chair across from Grace. "Not at all," Grace replied. "I'm early by nature." They ordered lunch-grilled salmon for Julia, a turkey sandwich for Grayson. Once the waiter had stepped away, Julia leaned forward slightly. "I did some research on you," she said, without apology. Grace raised her eyebrows but said nothing. "You were the director of your church's community outreach program for 8 years. Before that, you were PTA president for 5. You helped organize disaster relief kits during the winter storms in 9. Your name came up in a few local papers." "That's all a long time ago," Grace replied. "Still impressive," Julia said. "And relevant. My company is launching a new initiative, an in-store experience program that reimagines how we design space and services for women over 50. Right now, retail caters to trends, youth, speed, but we've been missing an entire demographic that deserves beauty, dignity, and practical value. We're correcting that." Grace listened intently, unsure where this was going, but intrigued by Julia's tone. It wasn't rehearsed. It was personal. "We need someone who understands that demographic from the inside," Julia continued. "Someone who knows what it feels like to walk into a store and feel unseen. You walked into Maple Maine and were dismissed before you even opened your folder. That experience? That insight? That's precisely what we're trying to change." "You want me to help you design stores?" Grace asked, half amused, half skeptical. "I want you to consult. We're starting with 5 flagship locations. I want someone at the table who can see what we're not seeing." Grace considered this. "I don't have a degree in design." "You don't need one. You've been managing spaces and people your whole life. That's what this is about. Seeing things differently, understanding what matters." The waiter returned with their food, and the conversation paused while they adjusted plates and poured water. As Grace took her first bite, her mind raced. She hadn't been expecting this, not at all. A job interview disguised as a thank-you lunch. A real opportunity, not out of pity, but out of recognition. "Would it be full-time?" she asked. "Not at first. We'd start part-time, flexible hours. A few meetings a week, some store visits, feedback sessions with our designers. We'll pay you fairly, of course. And if it works, we discuss a more permanent role." Grace took a long sip of water and set her glass down gently. "Why me?" Julia's face softened. "Because you reminded me of my mother. Because when you caught my son, I saw a woman who didn't freeze. You acted, and when I spoke to you afterward, you didn't boast. You stayed calm, composed, humble. I think people like you make things better just by being present." Grace felt something warm rise in her chest, a rare mix of flattery and humility. "I'll try it," she said, surprising even herself. Julia grinned. "Good. I'll have my assistant reach out to set up onboarding. We'll start slow." They finished their meal, talking about everything but work. Grace learned that Julia had grown up in the Midwest, that she'd worked her way up from store clerk to executive, that Benji was her only child, and that motherhood had startled her in ways nothing else ever had. Julia, in turn, asked Grace about her garden, her favorite books, what she missed most about teaching Sunday school. They parted warmly, with a promise to talk again soon. Grace walked back to her car that day, not with doubt, but with a strange buoyancy in her steps. There was no certainty of what this job would become. There were still aches in her body, and fears she didn't name. But for the first time in years, something new had opened, something she had not dared imagine. Not just the beginning of a job, the beginning of something else entirely. The days that followed passed in a kind of gentle hum, a rhythm Grace hadn't known she missed until it returned. The morning walks were crisper now, the air cooler as the first hints of autumn whispered through the trees lining her neighborhood. Leaves had begun to yellow at the edges. She noticed things she hadn't paid attention to in months, the neighbor's wind chimes, a cat sunning itself on a porch rail, the earthy scent of soil after last night's rain. For the first time in a long while, She wasn't walking to keep loneliness at bay. She walked with purpose, with quiet anticipation. Julia had said her assistant would be in touch, and Grace checked her phone more often now, watching for an unfamiliar number, something new to break the rhythm of stillness. It came on a Thursday afternoon. The ring was short and unassuming, but Grace's pulse quickened as she answered. "Mrs. Delaney?" said a brisk, pleasant voice. "This is Talia from Barrett Brands. Julia asked me to schedule your onboarding for the pilot program. Are you available to come in this Friday at 10? Grace cleared her throat, suddenly nervous despite herself. Yes, I can be there." Talia gave her the address and office complex about 25 minutes from her house, and a list of things to bring: identification, proof of address, a notepad if she preferred handwritten notes. "Casual business attire is fine," she added, "and don't worry, you'll be meeting with a small team just, an intro session, nothing formal." After the call ended, Grace sat at her kitchen table in silence, staring at the old fruit bowl in front of her. There were 2 oranges and a single bruised apple inside, none of which she felt like eating. Her fingers tapped lightly against the tabletop, and then she stood and walked to the hallway mirror. She studied her reflection. The silver hair was neatly combed, pulled back into a low bun. Her face held the lines of years well spent, decades of laughter and strain. She didn't look young, but she didn't look small or forgotten either. She looked real. She pressed a hand to her chest and whispered to the woman staring back, "You're going to do this." The next morning, she arrived 10 minutes early. The office was sleek without being sterile, with tall windows and pale wood floors. A receptionist greeted her with a badge already printed and asked her to wait in a sitting area adorned with books about branding, culture, and design. Grace picked one up, flipping through pages of color palettes and typography. A few minutes later, Julia appeared, dressed in a fitted navy blazer and soft gray slacks. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, and she smiled warmly. "Welcome," she said, extending a hand. "Come on back. Let me show you where the magic happens." Grace followed her down a corridor where open workstations hummed with quiet energy. People leaned over drawings, clicked through presentations on sleek laptops, and pinned fabric swatches to mood boards. There was a buzz in the air, not frantic but alive, like something in motion. They entered a glass-walled conference room, where 2 others were already seated. A young man with curly hair and a wide grin, and a woman with square glasses and a tablet in her lap. "This is Marcus and Priya," Julia said. "They're part of our experienced design team. You'll be working closely with them." Marcus stood to shake her hand. "We've heard a lot about you." "All good, I hope," Grace said with a smile. "Only the heroic stuff," Priya replied. "Catching babies, turning heads, the usual." Grace laughed softly, easing into her seat. Julia handed her a simple folder with her name on it. Inside was a welcome letter, a rough outline of the pilot program, and a list of the 5 flagship locations they were targeting for redesign. Grace read each word carefully, absorbing the language. The words felt real, not like the vague corporate speak she had expected. There were questions under each section. How do older women navigate this space? What's missing? What feels uninviting? How can we honor their presence instead of simply tolerating it? Julia leaned in. "We want your eyes on this. Not from behind a desk, but out in the stores. Think about the layout, the lighting, the signage. Talk to shoppers if you're comfortable. Observe and reflect. You're not here to give us what we already know. You're here because you notice what we don't." Grace nodded, flipping to the next page. "I can do that." "You'll be compensated per visit, and we'll bring you in once a week to discuss your findings," Julia added. "Eventually, if things go well, we'll involve you in co-design sessions. That's where we build the new concepts together." Marcus handed her a sample packet of photo snapshots of shelving, fitting rooms, customer service desks. Some were clean and modern, others cluttered and confusing. Grace studied them thoughtfully. "These stores are beautiful," she said, pointing to one of the sleeker photos. "But they all assume the shopper moves like a 20-year-old. You've got mirrors too high for women under 5'5". You've got carts that are too heavy when loaded. And the music, well, I'd need aspirin before I hit the third aisle." Julia laughed, delighted. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say." They spent the next hour walking her through expectations. Nothing rushed, nothing overwhelming. Julia had created a space where Grace's experience was not only welcomed, but central. She asked questions Grace hadn't considered in years. What made her feel seen? What did comfort look like? What small things made a big difference? When the session ended, Grace gathered her folder and stood slowly. She felt a twinge in her knee, but ignored it. Julia walked her back to the lobby and paused by the elevator. "I meant it, you know," she said. "This isn't a trial to me. This is a beginning." Grace met her eyes. "It feels that way." As the elevator doors closed, Grace felt a flutter in her stomach. Not nerves this time, but anticipation. She hadn't known how much she needed to be asked. Not just to show up or to volunteer her time, but to share her mind, her insight, her story. It had been so long since someone looked at her and saw value. She drove home with the windows down, the cool air tugging at her sleeves. The folder sat in the passenger seat beside her, not unlike Julia's business card had just days before. It felt weighty in a different way now, not a question, but a door that had opened. That evening, she pulled an old journal from her bedroom drawer, one she hadn't touched since Tom passed. She hadn't known why she kept it on the nightstand. Maybe for this. She flipped to a fresh page and began to write. First day. Walked into something I never saw coming. Not a job, not quite. A chance to be heard. Then she turned the page and wrote more. Grace woke early on Monday, well before the sun crested the rooftops of her neighborhood. It had become a habit during the later years of Tom's illness, rising before the world stirred, claiming that quiet stretch of time when the house felt both sacred and undemanding. This morning, however, there was something different about the way she moved through her routine. Her steps carried intention, and the lingering sadness that usually accompanied her breakfast had been replaced with the sharp focus of preparation. She dressed with care, choosing a soft olive blouse and dark gray slacks that flattered her without drawing attention. She added a scarf with a splash of color, something her oldest daughter had given her last Christmas. It wasn't flashy, but it spoke of presence. When she looked in the mirror, she saw not a woman lost in the past, but someone who had someplace to be. That made her smile, and the smile, in turn, made her stand a little taller. The drive to the first store on her assignment list took nearly 40 minutes. It was a large branch in an affluent suburban plaza, designed with clean glass facades and minimalist landscaping. The storefront shone in the morning light, freshly washed, inviting. Grace parked near the entrance and sat in her car for a moment, scanning the welcome packet Julia had given her again. The questions were simple. How does the space make you feel? Are the entrances and pathways intuitive? Is there warmth in the design, or does it lean too heavily on efficiency? She stepped out of the car and entered the store slowly, as a customer would. Not as someone sent to evaluate, but as a woman simply shopping. That had been Julia's suggestion. Walk through it like it's your Saturday. Let the space speak to you. And it did. The floors gleamed. Racks of clothing stood like art pieces, in precise rows. The scent of soft linen and lavender hung in the air. It was beautiful. But as Grace wandered the aisles, she noticed things that might go unseen by others. The signage, though elegant, sat at awkward angles. You had to tilt your head to read them. The lighting near the fitting rooms was almost clinical, washing out skin tones in harsh whites. The chairs for waiting companions were narrow, more decorative than useful. A woman about her age tried one and stood up moments later, rubbing her back. Grace made a note. She took her time, watching other women move through the space. Some walked with canes. One pushed a stroller while balancing a purse and shopping bag on one arm. Grace followed the flow of their paths. She saw how they paused before signs, how they hesitated at junctions where the store opened into different departments without clear direction. A younger employee darted past her, barely glancing up as he restocked a shelf. Grace watched an older woman ask him for assistance, only to be pointed vaguely toward the rear. Grace approached the same associate, smiling gently. "Excuse me," she said. "Can you tell me where the plus-size denim is?" The boy blinked. It's kind of toward the back, behind housewares. Left of the seasonal stuff." "Thank you," she said, noting how unhelpful that actually was. She walked there anyway, and saw that the section he referenced had no signage and fewer mirrors. One mirror had a crack in the corner, patched with clear tape. She made another note. By the time she reached the checkout lanes, she had gathered enough impressions to fill 3 pages, but what stood out most wasn't the flaws. It was the way the women in the store behaved. Many moved slowly, not because they were unsure, but because they were deliberate. They paused to feel fabrics, to inspect stitching. They carried items with care, not haste. They were not inefficient. They were thoughtful, and yet the store's layout seemed to misinterpret that pacing as inconvenience. Back in her car, Grace took out her notepad again and jotted a final line. "They're not being slow, they're being intentional, and the space doesn't honor that." She stopped for coffee on the way back to the office, choosing a small cafe over the chain shop she usually defaulted to. She sat at a window seat and reviewed her notes with fresh eyes. These weren't just criticisms. They were opportunities. Her thoughts carried the weight of years spent navigating spaces like this as a mother, a caregiver, and now someone beginning again. When she returned to the office, Talia greeted her warmly and led her to a small conference room already equipped with a tablet, a dry erase board, and a carafe of lemon water. Marcus arrived a few minutes later, fresh from another store visit of his own, holding a pastry wrapped in wax paper. "How was your first walkthrough?" he asked, tearing off a piece and offering to share. Grace declined the pastry but smiled. "It was beautiful, but it wasn't designed for someone like me." "Tell me," he said, taking out his laptop. She walked him through her observations, pausing only when he asked questions to clarify. He listened without interrupting, his expression focused, occasionally breaking into a grin when something she said aligned with his own frustrations. When she mentioned the cracked mirror, his fingers flew over the keyboard. "That's something we can fix in under a week," he said. "The signage, though, yeah, that's a bigger conversation." "Why not just lower it?" Grace asked. "It's decorative, but if you can't read it without craning your neck, it isn't working. It's one of those designer over-function battles," he said, laughing. She shook her head. "Function always wins eventually." By the time Priya joined them, Grace had filled 3 whiteboard panels with examples, sketches, and alternatives. She talked about warmth, about eye-level placement, about the soundscape of the store, and how younger designers underestimated the fatigue caused by certain high-pitched lighting or rhythmic overhead music. Priya nodded enthusiastically and began typing out segments of Grace's phrasing verbatim. Julia arrived mid-meeting and stood quietly by the glass wall, watching. She didn't speak until there was a lull. "This," she said finally, "is exactly what I hoped for." Grace turned, surprised to see her. Julia stepped inside, closed the door gently, and added, "You're not just noticing problems, you're framing a different way of seeing." Grace hesitated. "I'm just telling you how it feels." "And that's exactly what we need," Julia replied. The rest of the meeting flowed like water. Grace forgot her nerves. She forgot that this was new. She forgot to question whether she belonged. When the discussion finally ended, and Marcus walked her to the elevator, he turned to her and said, "I've worked here 5 years. That was the most useful 3 hours I've had in a long time." Grace smiled, her face warming. "Thanks for saying that." As she rode down in the elevator, watching the numbers descend, she felt the tension in her shoulders melt into something lighter. She had stepped into a new world today, one filled with glass walls and buzzing screens and words like activation and spatial harmony. But within all of that, she had found something simple and profound. Her voice still mattered. Her insight could shape things. And she wasn't a guest here, she was part of it now. The invitation came on a Wednesday morning, delivered in a slender envelope tucked inside her mailbox, its weight surprisingly elegant. Grace had just returned from a store walkthrough in a quieter part of town where she'd observed more grandmothers than teenagers shopping for linen throws and baking dishes. She had jotted down notes about the narrow aisles, the absence of seating, and how the lighting turned every warm tone in the home section a cold shade of silver. She was tired by the time she got home, the pleasant kind of tired that comes from knowing you've used your time wisely. The envelope waiting in her box changed the course of her day. It was embossed with the company's name and sealed with a subtle gray sticker. Inside, a folded cream cardstock announced a seasonal gala hosted by Barrett Brands, with the theme printed in clean serif font, Legacy in Design. Grace turned it over, reading the note penned at the bottom in Julia's unmistakable handwriting. I hope you'll come. Wear something you feel beautiful in, Jay. Grace sat down in her living room with the card in her hand. She hadn't been to anything resembling a gala in over a decade, not since her daughter's fundraising dinner for the local arts council. She'd worn a black dress then, with a velvet shawl that had made her feel like someone important. That dress no longer fit, and the shawl was lost somewhere in the cedar chest in the guest room. She set the card on the coffee table and sighed. Later that evening, she found herself at the back of a second-hand boutique downtown. It smelled faintly of lavender and cedar. The owner, a cheerful woman with bright eyes and silver braids, remembered Grace from the church donation drives. You need something elegant? She asked, guiding her past the scarves and jackets. Something that doesn't whisper. She's trying too hard, Grace replied. They laughed, and within 20 minutes, Grace stood in front of a tall mirror wearing a midnight blue dress with soft sleeves and a draped neckline. It fit her shape gently, giving without clinging. The hem swayed just below her knees, and when she turned slightly, the fabric shimmered in the light. She looked like a woman with somewhere to go. 2 evenings later, Grace stood outside the grand entrance of a historic venue downtown, staring up at the glowing glass windows and twinkling lights strung like stars across the facade. The street was lined with luxury cars and guests, in polished suits and gowns. For a moment she hesitated. Then she squared her shoulders, stepped out of the car, and walked toward the entrance. Inside, the space was alive with movement. Waiters moved quietly with trays of sparkling water and wine. Conversations rose in waves, punctuated by laughter and polite applause from the corner where a jazz trio played near the gallery displays. The walls were adorned with images from the company's recent campaign-screen lines, happy families, timeless settings. Grace walked slowly, taking it in. Julia found her within minutes, wearing a floor-length silver gown that shimmered like moonlight and caught the eye of every person she passed. She reached for Grace's hand. You look radiant, she said genuinely. I feel like someone borrowed, Grace answered. No, you're exactly yourself, Julia said. Come, I want to introduce you to someone. She led Grace through the crowd, weaving through clusters of designers, executives, and investors. They stopped at a smaller group gathered near the open bar, where a tall man in a charcoal suit leaned casually against a marble column. His hair was peppered gray, swept back, and his eyes lit up when he turned to see Julia. David, she said, touching his arm lightly, this is Grace Delaney. Grace, meet David Lang. David extended his hand. The woman who caught my godson out of the sky. Grace shook his hand, slightly amused. And you must be the man who builds buildings that probably don't have loose railings. Julia laughed and excused herself to greet a group of board members. Grace remained beside David, who offered her a glass of something golden and crisp. They talked easily. He told her about his recent projects, including a sustainable housing model for seniors, and how frustrating it was to convince city councils to approve anything that wasn't made of gray concrete. She shared stories from her early years as a young mother, how she and Tom had saved for every piece of furniture they owned, and how her dining table still had a nick from the time her daughter tried to slice a watermelon with a butter knife. David was easy to talk to. He asked thoughtful questions, laughed without forcing it, and never once looked distracted. Grace felt herself loosening in his presence, letting the rhythm of the evening carry her forward. When the band switched to a slower tempo, he leaned slightly closer. "Would you like to dance?" She hesitated, caught off guard. "I haven't danced in a long time." "Well, then it's overdue," he said, holding out his hand. They moved to the edge of the floor. The music wrapped around them like silk, and Grace let herself be guided into the slow sway of the song. David's touch was light, respectful. They didn't speak for the first few measures, just moved together in the quiet of the moment. Eventually, she looked up at him. "You're very good at this." "My mother insisted I learn before I could drive," he said, smiling. "Said no man worth his salt should step into the world without knowing how to hold someone without stepping on their feet." She laughed, and the sound surprised her. It had been a long time since she had laughed like that. The song ended, and they stepped apart gently. "I'd like to see you again," David said, not pushing, just offering. Grace looked at him, really looked. There was something steady in his eyes. He wasn't playing a part, wasn't offering a compliment in exchange for anything. "Maybe you will," she said. Later, as she stood near the large windows overlooking the city skyline, Julia returned to her side with a glass of water and a knowing smile. "I see you met David." "I did." Julia sipped her drink. "He's been through his own storm, lost his wife 3 years ago. Since then, he's rebuilt almost everything but his evenings." Grace turned her gaze out the window. "Funny. I've only rebuilt my evenings. The rest is still coming into focus." "Well," Julia said gently, "maybe this is where the two meet." Grace said nothing, but her silence held the shape of something new forming. Not certainty, not yet, but something softer, more patient, a possibility. When she returned home that night, she stepped out of her shoes and walked barefoot through the living room, the floor cool beneath her feet. She paused at the mirror in the hallway, catching a glimpse of her reflection. Her cheeks still held color, her eyes, something brighter than usual. She looked like a woman who had remembered how it felt to move through the world not just with purpose, but with joy. 2 weeks passed in a flurry of movement. Grace found herself busier than she had been in years. She spent her days walking through stores with a clipboard in one hand and her shoulder bag hanging comfortably at her side, jotting observations in steady cursive, occasionally snapping photos when a display confused or delighted her. She began meeting with Marcus and Priya regularly, sometimes one-on-one, sometimes in brief strategy sessions where they invited her to draw ideas on whiteboards or weigh in on small layout mock-ups. There was a quiet joy in the rhythm of it, the way her opinions were no longer passed over or softened, but instead requested and applied. The stores she visited varied widely. Some were tucked in sleepy suburbs where shoppers moved with a slower, more conversational pace. Others buzzed with energy from morning until dusk, urban flagships that required Grace to navigate escalators, parking decks, and the kind of music that made her teeth clench. Through it all, she collected impressions. She noted the placement of furniture, the height of hooks, the behavior of customers in dressing rooms and checkout lines. She filled 2 full notebooks with her handwriting and found, to her surprise, that each word she wrote felt like a piece of herself finding its way back. Julia often stopped by to check on her, sometimes just to listen, sometimes to press Grace for her thoughts on a color scheme or a concept slide from marketing. Grace had never been part of a world like this, but something about it felt familiar. It reminded her of the volunteer kitchens she used to organize, the community drives she once led. The energy of people trying to do something good, something that made others feel cared for. Then, one morning, Grace arrived to find a strange silence in the office. People moved quickly, avoiding eye contact. A few glanced her way and then looked down just as fast. Marcus wasn't at his desk. Priya's door was closed. Talia gave her a short wave and a distracted smile, but offered no greeting beyond that. Grace stood in the hallway, her notebook in hand, sensing something wrong. She found out only an hour later, during a scheduled team meeting, that Julia had to cancel at the last minute. Priya finally emerged from her office, her face tight with frustration, and pulled Grace aside into one of the smaller conference rooms. "There's something going around the office," Priya said, her voice low. "Someone leaked the security footage from the mall, the one showing you catching the kid." Grace blinked. "What?" "Not just leaked it. Shared it online. It's on 2 news sites already. The headline is dramatic: Widow saves toddler in shocking mall fall." Grace sat down slowly, her heart beginning to thump in her chest. Priya continued, "Most of the attention has been positive. People are praising your reflexes, your calm, your heroism. But someone here thinks it's a problem. A few people are saying you only got hired because of that incident. That Julia gave you the role because you saved her son." Grace's hands went cold. She looked down at her lap, then back at Priya. "But that's not true." "I know," Priya said. "Everyone who's worked with you knows, but corporate politics don't care about the truth. Someone clearly wants to discredit you. Maybe they're jealous. Maybe they were gunning for the same role before it even existed." Grace felt a knot rise in her throat, something that hadn't been there in years. She had fought so hard not to be seen as a relic. She had worked quietly, honestly, giving her all. And now, her most human moment was being weaponized against her. "I never asked for this," she whispered. "I know," Priya said again, "and I'm sorry. But we're with you. Marcus and I are already preparing a response." Julia's furious. That afternoon, Grace went home early. She sat in her garden chair and listened to the rustling of leaves, trying to push back the growing anxiety. She hadn't told her daughters about the job yet, not in detail. She didn't want them to worry if it didn't last. Now, she wondered if she would even get the chance to explain it properly before the damage was done. The next morning, everything changed again. Grace woke to her phone buzzing over and over on the nightstand. She reached for it, squinting at the screen. Messages from coworkers, a missed call from Julia, links to news articles. When she opened the first one, she gasped. The video had gone viral, but not in the way she feared. People were rallying around her. Comments poured in praising her calm, her courage, her swiftness. A retired firefighter had shared the clip, calling her instincts flawless. A pediatric nurse had posted a thread breaking down how rare it was for someone to respond in time to catch a falling child. People began calling her the catching widow, a phrase she didn't love but didn't entirely mind. Then she saw Julia's public statement, posted across the company's official platforms. This company was founded on courage, on care, and on legacy. Grace Delaney embodies all 3. She was not hired out of sentiment. She was hired because of her wisdom, her clarity, and the voice she gives to millions of women whose needs are too often overlooked. We stand with her, not because of what she did in a single moment, but because of what she has continued to do, day after day. Grace sat on the edge of her bed, her hand over her mouth. By noon, Julia had called her directly. "I should have warned you this might happen," she said. "I underestimated how quickly admiration can turn into jealousy." "You didn't owe me anything," Grace replied. "You gave me a chance. That was enough." "No," Julia said. "You gave us the chance. You're not going anywhere." They spoke for 10 more minutes, and by the time they hung up, Grace felt something shift in her again. Not defensiveness, not shame, something steadier, a kind of grounding. When she walked into the office the next day, Marcus met her at the door with a paper coffee cup and a smile that bordered on reverent. "They're calling you the face of practical brilliance," he said. "That sounds like something you'd find on a mug." she joked, and he laughed. But the air in the office had changed. Coworkers, who had once looked through her, now looked at her with something close to respect. One even clapped her on the shoulder and said, "I hope I move like you when I'm older." Grace smiled politely and returned to her desk, but deep down, she knew it wasn't about moving quickly or being young. It was about staying present, staying clear. It was about showing up every single day with nothing to prove but everything to offer. A week after the media firestorm had begun to settle, Grace found herself in the break room, standing over the coffee machine while it whirred and clicked, releasing steam like a tiny engine. She had grown used to the rhythm of the office now, the low hum of keyboards, the way the design teams spread their work across every flat surface, the scent of eucalyptus from someone's diffuser in the creative corner. It no longer felt foreign. It felt like part of her day, a place she belonged. She poured her coffee and turned to find Julia standing in the doorway, arms crossed gently over a folder. Her expression was warm, but her eyes were serious. "Can we talk for a minute?" she asked. Grace nodded, following her down the hall to the corner office. Julia closed the door behind them and motioned for her to sit. "There's a proposal I want to run by you," Julia said, placing the folder in front of her. "We've been thinking of expanding the scope of your role. What you've done already, your reports, your walkthroughs, your perspective, it's turned a lot of heads in the right way. Senior leadership is paying attention, and they want more of you in the process." Grace listened, coffee still in her hand, the warmth of it pressing through the ceramic and into her fingers. "More how?" she asked. "They want you in the creative sessions now, not just observing layouts, but helping us build them from the ground up. We're designing a new concept store next quarter, a test space. If it works, it'll become a model we replicate across every location in the country." Grace blinked. "You want me designing stores?" "With a team," Julia said. "But yes, we want you contributing at every level. You have instincts. No one else here does." Grace opened the folder. Inside was a rough mock-up of the new concept. A spacious layout, wider aisles, adjustable lighting, lounge seating near dressing rooms, calming textures, displays curated not by age, but by need and rhythm of life. She skimmed through the pages, surprised to see some of her earlier ideas already translated into renderings. "I don't have a design degree," she said quietly, though not with self-doubt, more as a practical reminder. Julia smiled. "Neither did my grandmother, and she taught me everything I know about space and comfort. We're not hiring degrees, Grace. We're hiring wisdom, yours." Grace sat with the proposal in her lap, her thoughts unusually still. For most of her life, she had worked in the margins, behind the scenes. This felt like stepping into the center of the room. And strangely, she wasn't afraid. Later that afternoon, after the meeting had ended and the folder was tucked into her bag, she returned to her desk to find an envelope leaning against her keyboard. No label, no handwriting. Inside was a card. The front read, "What you did still matters." She opened it. The note inside was printed on plain cream paper in delicate handwriting. "I watched the video 5 times before I realized what moved me wasn't that you caught him. It was how steady you looked afterward. Like this wasn't something you stumbled into, it was something you were built for. Thank you for showing us how to move through chaos with grace. Anonymous." Grace read the note twice. She didn't recognize the handwriting, but something about it hit a chord that vibrated quietly inside her for the rest of the day. By week's end, Julia had arranged for Grace to attend her first creative strategy session. It was held off-site, in a studio loft flooded with natural light and filled with textiles, foam models, and long whiteboards covered in sketches. The lead designer, a man in his early 40s named Theo, greeted her with an open smile and a seat at the table beside the visual merchandiser and a marketing director who seemed far too young to be in charge of anything. But they listened to her. She spoke up cautiously at first, only when prompted. Then more easily, as her confidence grew. She noticed where Theo's plans looked beautiful but wouldn't work for someone using a walker. She pointed out how too many design features required customers to crouch, twist, or lift. By the end of the session, the whiteboard was covered in new sketches, revised angles, and measurements that hadn't been considered before. On the drive home, Grace rolled her window down and let the wind catch the edge of her scarf. She thought of Tom. He would have teased her about being the one to teach designers a thing or two. He had always called her his compass, the one who knew where comfort lived in every room. That evening, Grace visited the neighborhood bookstore for the first time in months. She wandered the aisles, fingers drifting over spines, until she found the section on architecture and design. She pulled down a thick, illustrated book on modern interiors and sat in the corner chair, flipping through the pages. She saw what was missing in many of the layouts. She saw opportunities. She saw herself in the spaces. The next morning, a different kind of surprise awaited her. She walked into the office to find the team gathered near the entrance. Julia stood at the front, holding a small bouquet of white lilies and yellow tulips. "Grace," she said, beaming, "we've decided to officially title your role. You're no longer just a consultant." Grace blinked. "I'm not?" "You are now our senior advisor for inclusive design." The room broke into polite applause. Marcus gave her a short bow. Priya snapped a photo before Grace could protest. She felt warmth rise in her face, not from embarrassment, but from something else entirely. It was recognition, not symbolic, not for a news story. Real, grounded, earned. After the gathering dispersed, Julia walked with her to the back corridor. "Do you remember what you told me the day we first had lunch?" she asked. Grace tried to recall. "I said I was just doing what anyone would have done." "No," Julia said. "You said catching that boy wasn't luck. You said it was instinct. You were wrong. It was purpose." Grace didn't reply, not because she disagreed, but because she felt the truth of it in her chest. That night, as she curled into her reading chair, legs covered in a patchwork quilt, she flipped back through the journal she had begun the day after her first meeting with Julia. She added a new entry. "I am not waiting to be useful anymore. I am useful. I am not lucky. I am prepared. I am not a placeholder. I am the shape of what's possible when someone dares to believe in you." She closed the journal and set it beside her tea. Tomorrow, the team would begin drafting plans for a store built entirely from her notes. Tomorrow, she would sit in a room with people decades younger than her and offer ideas they had never thought to see. Tomorrow, she would walk through a space in her mind and sketch how a woman like her might move through it with ease. And tomorrow, she would remember none of this had come from being fast. It had come from being present, being steady, and knowing when to catch what mattered. The sun glinted off the marble floor of the atrium as Grace stepped into the newly renovated concept store for the first time. It wasn't entirely finished. The glass doors still bore faint chalk marks from the installation crew, and a few wires hung down from the ceiling where the lighting team was finishing adjustments. But the bones of it were there, clear and full of promise. She stood near the entrance and took in the wide aisles, the soft lighting, the matte wood finishes that replaced the cold, gleaming white of the older layout. It felt like walking into a home that hadn't yet been lived in but was already waiting for someone. Marcus approached from the back, holding a tablet in one hand, his hair slightly tousled from a morning spent with the floor team. "We're ahead of schedule," he said, smiling. "And the regional manager just gave us a thumbs up on the final build. Want to do the first walkthrough?" Grace nodded, and they began to move through the store together. She noticed small things first. The entry mat was heavier than standard, one that would not slip beneath unsure feet. The carts were redesigned, lighter and easier to turn. On the right side of the entrance, there was a low bench, curved and welcoming. Beneath a display titled, "For You, at Your Pace," it showcased cozy cardigans, soft walking shoes, and herbal teas. Nothing about it screamed age or limitation. It whispered comfort and care. In the center of the store, where loud music usually pulsed from overhead speakers, There was instead a soft instrumental melody that seemed to hum through the space without demanding attention. The lights above were a warm ivory, not fluorescent, and they could be adjusted manually from a tablet at the front counter. Marcus tapped the screen and demonstrated how they could dim slightly during afternoon hours or brighten when the skies outside turned gray. At the back, a new feature had been installed: a rest corner with plush chairs, a free water station, and shelves filled with books and puzzles designed for companions who needed to wait. Grace sat in one of the chairs, bounced lightly in the cushion, then looked up at Marcus with a grin. "This is good," she said. "Not just functional, welcoming." "That's the whole idea," Marcus said, his eyes proud but tired. "And your notes made it all possible." They finished the walk-through just as a group of regional leaders arrived, led by Julia. She wore her usual smart slacks and blazer, but there was a touch of something different in her posture, something lighter, less guarded. When she saw Grace, she broke into a wide smile and walked over immediately. "We're getting great feedback," Julia said, "and the official launch is next week, but I wanted you to see it before anyone else." Grace nodded, a lump forming in her throat. "It's beautiful. Because of you," Julia said. "You brought the heart into the architecture." They all moved into the lounge area for a short meeting. The discussion turned to expansion, how this store might be used as a case study to push for broader changes across the company. Grace listened quietly at first, then offered several ideas, including mobile cart stations for those who couldn't walk the full store and updated signage for the visually impaired. The team took notes. They looked to her as if she were not just present, but necessary. It was a feeling she could not remember having in decades. Later that afternoon, as the others drifted out and the showroom lights dimmed automatically with the setting sun, Julia pulled Grace aside. "I need to ask you something that's not entirely business," she said. Grace turned to her, curious. "All right. It's about David," Julia said. "He's accepted a new contract in Florence. It's a 2-year project. Mixed-use buildings, a sustainability model, some really beautiful work. He's leaving in 3 weeks. Grace felt her breath catch just slightly, not from surprise, but from the confirmation of something she'd suspected. David had mentioned new opportunities abroad, but he hadn't been specific. Still, she had sensed a shift in his tone, a quiet restlessness under the surface. "I see," Grace said carefully. "He didn't want to say anything until he'd spoken to you first," Julia added. "But I know he's torn. I also know he wants to see you before he leaves." Grace nodded slowly. "Thank you for telling me." Julia gave her a soft smile. "I think he thought it would be selfish to ask you to go." Grace spent the evening in quiet thought. She walked through her garden at dusk, watching the last bees circle the lavender plants. The wind curled around her, gentle and persistent. When she entered the house, she moved not to the television or the stove, but to her journal. She opened to a blank page and began to write. Change does not ask for permission. It arrives like a letter without a return address. You can choose to open it or ignore it, but either way, it is yours. She closed the book and picked up her phone. David answered on the second ring. His voice was warm, and the sound of it filled the quiet of her living room like music. "I heard you've been promoted again," he said. "I heard you're running off to Italy," she replied. He laughed. "That's a version of it." They talked for an hour, falling easily into the rhythm they had discovered that night on the dance floor. David told her about the project, the challenges ahead, the way the buildings would reflect sunlight through narrow streets. Grace listened, then told him about the new store, how it felt to see her thoughts turned into form and space. When he finally asked, "Would you ever consider coming with me?" he did not say it with pressure. It was an invitation, not a demand. Grace paused. "I would," she said, "but not yet." "Because of the work?" "Because of what I've just begun to build," she said. "It's more than a job. It's a way forward, for me, for others like me." There was silence on the other end, but it was not disappointed. It was full of understanding. "I'll come back," he said. and we'll pick up from there." She smiled into the phone. "That sounds about right." They ended the call with no promises, just a sense of clarity. They were not closing a door. They were allowing space for it to swing open when the time was right. That night, Grace did not feel torn. She felt grounded. She had made a choice, not just to stay, but to stay with purpose. The following morning, she arrived early to the new store. The doors were still locked, and the staff hadn't arrived yet. She stood outside for a long moment, watching the light inside begin to brighten through the timed systems they had installed. When she finally unlocked the door, she stepped into the stillness of the space. It smelled faintly of cedar and clean cotton. The music system had not yet turned on. For a few minutes, she was alone in the world she had helped shape. She walked the aisles slowly, brushing her hand along the back of a display chair, pausing to straighten a sign, smiling at the small touch of a welcome mat at the restroom that read, "Take your time." She wasn't racing toward anything anymore. She wasn't waiting for validation. She was simply walking her own pace, in a space she had helped create. And when she turned the lights on fully, it felt like she was opening the door not just to a store, but to everything still ahead. The morning of the grand opening arrived with the kind of crisp breeze that signaled the true start of autumn. Grace stood just beyond the entrance, near the wide glass doors that gleamed in the soft light of early day. Employees moved in a quiet bustle around her, adjusting displays, straightening shelves, and setting out trays of refreshments near the welcome counter. The air smelled of cinnamon and cedar, chosen intentionally for its sense of warmth and nostalgia. There was a hum of excitement all around her, but Grace stood still, taking it in. She had arrived early, long before the ribbon-cutting ceremony was set to begin. It wasn't out of nervousness, but rather a kind of reverence. This store, this space, had become something more than a workplace. It was a symbol, not just of her journey, but of what could be built when people listened to voices they too often overlooked. She moved slowly through the store, pausing here and there to study the details she had fought for. The mirrors in the fitting rooms were now adjustable, both in height and angle. The checkout lanes had wide, padded benches placed near them for companions who might need a rest. Throughout the aisles, new signs had been installed with larger, bolder type and simpler language, making it easier to navigate without strain. A wall near the entrance had been dedicated to stories from customers, written on framed cards in looping, lived-in handwriting. "I came here for towels, but I stayed because I felt seen." As she moved through the home section, she spotted one of her favorite touches, a small table set with a faux tea service and a display titled "Moments That Matter." On it were soft throws, journals, herbal teas, and photo frames. It wasn't about selling items. It was about honoring the quiet rituals that gave people their sense of place. Julia arrived around 8:30, looking radiant in a dark green blazer that complemented her auburn hair. She made a beeline for Grace, holding 2 takeaway cups. "Black coffee," she said, handing one over. "I thought I'd beat you here. I should have known better." Grace smiled, accepting the cup with both hands. "I needed a few quiet minutes before the flood. Press is coming. So are the regional heads. And I think corporate is sending someone from New York, though they didn't say who." Grace raised an eyebrow. "That sounds ominous." Julia grinned. "It's a good thing. They're paying attention. Your name came up in 3 separate planning calls this week, not just as a success story, as a strategy." Grace took a sip of coffee and let that settle in. She hadn't set out to become a name in any circle, much less one connected to strategy. She had wanted to be useful, to build something better than what she'd found. If that had turned into something others wanted to model, then maybe it meant she had done it right. By 10 o'clock, the store was filled with people. Customers, executives, media representatives, and a healthy mix of curious community members had trickled in as the doors officially opened. A ribbon had been tied across the main entryway of the retail floor, and a podium had been set near the front. Grace stood near Julia, watching the crowd gather. A woman from marketing gave the first speech, followed by the regional manager. Both spoke in polished tones about innovation, customer-first models, and the importance of inclusivity in modern retail. But it was Julia who stepped up to the microphone last and brought something real into the room. She looked out at the crowd and began by telling the story everyone knew now. A boy slipping from a balcony, a woman catching him in a moment that could have ended in tragedy. She spoke not with drama, but with quiet awe. But that moment didn't just save a child, she said, her voice clear and steady. It reminded me what we lose when we ignore the value of lived experience. Grace Delaney didn't just catch my son. She caught my attention, my assumptions, and turned them inside out. And because of her, we've changed the way we think about the people we serve. Julia turned then, and Grace felt dozens of eyes shift in her direction. She didn't flinch. She didn't fidget. She held her posture the same way she had in the pews of her church for so many years, with calm, with dignity. After the applause faded, Julia stepped aside and gestured for Grace to join her. At first, Grace hesitated, but Julia extended the scissors, and the message was clear. This moment belonged to her, too. Grace took the scissors with a nod. The ribbon was thick and taut. She cut cleanly through the center, and a cheer rose up from the crowd. The sound washed over her like sunlight. The rest of the day passed in a joyful blur. She walked the store with visitors, answering questions, listening to reactions. She met a grandmother from a neighboring town who said she hadn't enjoyed shopping in years but would drive 30 miles to come here again. She spoke with a teen who had brought her mother, a woman with limited mobility, and said, "My mom didn't need help once. Everything just made sense." Each conversation added something more to Grace's understanding of what she had helped create. Not a perfect store, but a thoughtful one, a place where needs weren't treated as exceptions but as part of the design. In the late afternoon, when most of the crowd had thinned and the energy had settled, Grace stepped outside to catch her breath. The sky had turned soft and amber. The wind stirred gently across the plaza. She heard footsteps behind her, and she turned to find David. He wore a charcoal coat and held his hands in his pockets. He looked tired, but the kind of tired that comes from finishing something worthwhile. "I couldn't stay away," he said. Grace smiled. "I'm glad." They stood in silence for a moment, looking at the building together. "You made something that's going to outlast you," he said. "That's rare." "I hope it invites more people to build their own version of it," she replied. He looked at her for a long time. "You still feel like this is where you're meant to be?" She nodded. "For now, there's still more to do, more people to reach. But I think I'm ready to imagine what comes next, too." He offered her his arm, and she took it. They didn't speak much after that. They didn't need to. The quiet between them was no longer about loss or fear. It was filled with the soft weight of understanding. Two people who had weathered storms and found in each other a reason not to drift. That night, Grace returned home to find a card waiting on her doorstep. No name on the envelope, just a note inside that read, "Thank you for showing me that the second half of life can be the beginning of everything." She placed the card on her mantel, beside a photo of Tom and a small vase of tulips that had begun to bloom early. Then she walked to her bedroom, changed into her robe, and opened her journal. Today we opened a door. Not just to a store, but to the kind of world I wish I had walked into sooner. A world where kindness is designed into the walls. Where purpose is not measured by pace, but by care. She paused, then added, "And the best part is, I didn't have to run to catch any of it. I just had to keep walking forward." She set the pen down, closed the journal, and turned out the light. The night was quiet, full of promise, and she was ready for whatever came next.